What I'm going to talk today about is the more general effects or typical effects of what happens after disasters such as our earthquake, and in particular a number of studies we've actually done here to demonstrate some of these findings. Before I get too far into this, I'd like to thank all my collaborators in this research, including Neville Plampa, who was just talking, Simon Kemp, Paul Russell, Michael Crimshaw, Martin Dorey, James Head, Ulrika Ozowski, and Jessica Richardson. In order to understand how events affect human beings, we kind of have to have a model of how human beings operate. Now, this is a stripped down model of how people engage in the environment. It's very stripped down and it's metaphorical, meaning the top part of that model, this part here, is this pool of attentional resources or cognitive resources. If we were to broaden the model out, it could be other resources. So this could also include things in your environment that you might need to get jobs done in that environment. Again, it's metaphorical, meaning if I were to open someone's head, there wouldn't actually be a pool of attentional goo in there that's getting funneled out to different tasks. However, as I'll talk about in the next slide, it does have some biological basis in reality, meaning when we do look at how the brain operates, it does seem to fit this model roughly. So basically, people have limited attentional resources or cognitive resources. This we know from biological reality, meaning although our brain is very impressive and it has billions of neurons that do little processing things like that and has trillions of connections between these billions of neurons, it is still physically limited. I mean, you cannot do everything you want to do at the same time. We know this. This is why, for example, in New Zealand, they've outlawed texting while you're driving your car because it gets in the way of driving the car. Now, part of that's the manual part of it, but actually most of the research shows, which the law hasn't caught up with, is that even hands-free telephone calls interfere with driving almost about as much as hands-on telephone calls. Okay, so we have these limited resources. Now, somewhere in the brain, there is an allocation system that determines where these resources will get, or what they'll get allocated to. Now, you could process immediate task demands or environmental demands. This is the stuff that's coming from your sensory systems, right? Vision, auditory, smell, tactile, so on. Right? That information that's coming in, you could process that, and so you could allocate most of your resources to processing the environmental demands. But that would make us a very limited creature, and as I'll talk about in a moment, it would make us a very unadaptive creature if all we did was process the immediate sensory information. It's helpful if we can do off-task processing. This is the internal stuff, what most people call daydreaming, right? Ruminations, the voice in the head where you're talking to yourself about what you're going to do in the future, or even some imagery that's in there, right? All of that is very adaptive, though, because it allows us to plan for the future. It allows us also to mentally time travel into the past or into the future, right? To deal with situations in a more adaptive way, because if all we did was rely on sensory information, it would be very impoverished. We wouldn't be able to do a lot of things we would do. And also, processing all the sensory information all the time is very demanding. To give an example of this, if you were to wake up in the middle of the night and go to the restroom, right? The bathroom, toilet, Johnny, whatever, and you're walking towards it, if you had to rely on all the sensory information, it would be difficult. Most of you probably can do it with your eyes closed because nothing's changed in the environment, right? What you're relying on is an internal representation, right? A model, a simulation, whatever you want to call that, that's in memories in our head of where things are in the space of that environment that helps you navigate to the toilet. This is one of the challenges with earthquakes. We'll talk about that. It changes the environment radically. So people can do this and allocate resources towards task demands or towards these internal processing demands, right? And they have costs, meaning you can't do everything you'd like to do, which is process everything. So you have to shuttle resources across these two things. Now, when people look at task demands, one of the things they do is they make what we call a secondary appraisal. Do I have enough capacity, right? Enough resources to meet the demands of the environment or the task that I'm given in the environment? If I don't, I'm going to feel something, and these are all feedback systems, these things we consciously feel, right? Are feedback systems to the whole body system, right? Think of it as the conscious states that you have are kind of like the global PA system of your body, right? That global workspace where you have conscious events are all feedback mechanisms to get all the little bits in your body that are doing its own little things to somehow cooperate to get things done. Global goals, right? Bigger goals. So one of the things people do is they say, do I have enough resources to meet the environmental demands? If I don't, I start to feel this thing we call negative emotional experiences, distress, stress, so on. That feeds back into the allocator. What it can do at some point is cause more resources, so you start shutting off some of this and the immediate thing. So if I have an immediate threatening situation and I say, oh gosh, I need a lot of resources to get this, to deal with this threat, I'll start probably shutting off some of the resources that are going to off-task demands. And you see that when people get into high threat situations, immediate threats, they tend to, what we call attentional focus, right? They funnel in on that immediate demand and they start shutting off thinking about other stuff. This is adaptive, it makes sense. Okay, but if the distress is so much and the demand is continuously demanding, it might throw us into what psychologists call the primary appraisal, which is, do I even need to be in this environment or do I need to be dealing with this demand? To give an example from my world, so let's say I go in tomorrow to my students, right, and I say, okay, by the next day in the morning, you got to write a 20-page paper with 200 references. Can you do that? And they're sitting there going, I don't think I have enough resources to meet this demand. I'm starting to feel distressed. And some of them might start to say, do I need to take this course? And so it'll make them go into that primary appraisal. They'll say, I want the out, which is I don't need to be doing this, right? Okay, so the part that does part of that is this resources that go to the off-task demands, which might feed back in to the primary appraisals, right? Do I need to be doing this thing, or do I need to be here? Which we call worry. Now, worry has a kind of negative connotation, but it doesn't have to be negative. It just happens to be a lot of times our worries are negative. They could be not negative, positive worries. What we really mean by that is all that internal thought, right? Not related necessarily to the sensory information you're pulling in at that time. Now, as I said, this does have links to actual biological data, meaning they have nowadays sophisticated ways to see what's going on in the brain while people are thinking about stuff or doing stuff. So, for example, if we went locally to this place called the Van Devere Institute, they have this thing called a functional magnetic resonance imaging device, right? Has anybody heard of this? Kind of know what I'm talking about? Okay, so you lay on your bed, right, and they slide you back into this big circular magnet, and by doing this, they can actually tell what parts of your brain are metabolically active when you're asked to do things. Now, what turns out to be the case is that you have 3 networks of regions of your brain that are kind of networked together and show activation together while you're doing things. Now, one of the networks is what they call the default mode network. Now, the default mode network, and I'll get to why they call it that, is largely about this bit here, the off-task processing. They call it the default mode network. It's because they discovered it when they had people laying in these contraptions, right, and they're imaging them and stuff like that, and they didn't ask them to do anything in particular, but just don't fall asleep. And they found that these areas consistently, what they call lit up, right, meaning they became metabolically active. This is what happens when you do things like autobiographical planning, which is a fancy way of saying daydream, right? Plan around those kind of personal planning, in some sense, these areas become lit up. So when you're not asked to do anything in this boring kind of situation where it's sitting back and you're thinking, oh, I got to think about something, what do I got to do today? Those areas light up consistently. The red bits here, which is called the dorsal attention network, it deals primarily with processing mostly visual, because that's what they've done in these magnetic resonance imaging chambers. But what we'd say is external sensory processing. So that's these red bits here. That's primarily the visual areas of the brain back here. And then the kind of uberarchical kind of processing areas, what they call the frontal parietal network. What some of you might have read, if you keep track of popular science kind of stuff, that, oh, we thought we found the seat of consciousness. And a lot of times it's considered in these frontal lobes, which are particularly well developed in human beings. And that does seem to reflect some reality, and you might consider that to be this bits in here, right? So these networks, this model does map onto, some sense, biological reality, right? That we have these different things. Now, what it turns out to be is that when you ask people to do things like autobiographical planning or daydreaming, the frontal network, which you'd expect if it's this thing, is active, and so is that default mode network. If you ask people to deal with a task, right, this bit here, the dorsal attention network, and the frontal parietal network are both active as well. What tends to happen, though, is these two are what they call anti-correlated, which means when one's active, it tries to suppress the other and vice versa, which again gets back to this bit, you can't do everything you'd like to do, meaning if you're taking resources to this, it's taken away from this and vice versa. Okay, so what does this mean for us? If we're dealing with something like an earthquake, where immediately after a very large, potentially destructive earthquake, right, it rearranges your environment. This is going to cause you to do a lot of remapping of the environment, right? And that's going to be what we call now popular in the press, earthquake brain, right? It basically is, and I'll give you a story of this, how we can think about this. And I don't want to sidetrack too far off, but back in about 2004, I went to this meeting called Recent Advances in Soft Computing. It was a fancy way of saying trying to do new things in computing that emulate what biological entities do, stuff like us. So at this meeting, it was mostly computer scientists, and there were two other characters there representing the other side of it, which is what they were trying to emulate, us and other critters. Me, representing people primarily, and this guy named Harry Irwin, who, although interesting enough, had a strong background in electrical engineering, but spent most of his most recent time studying bats. Now, the bats are really interesting because they really bring home this message that processing sensory information is very demanding, and it also has other implications as well. So I don't know how aware of most of you are of how bats operate, but there are big bats that eat fruit and they usually use vision, but there are small bats that eat insects and they mostly get around by sound, which means they send out a sound, right, and they listen for the echo return. Most of the things they're using to attack with this device, to find, right, some of them at least have evolved the ability to detect when they hear that echo sound from a bat to take evasive maneuvers. So what Harry was interested in doing is trying to come up with algorithms, right? These are computer software programs that can emulate how bats track targets. Now you can imagine all kinds of folks that might be interested in this, right? Because bats do it really, really well. I mean, you think about a bat brain, it's like the size of basically the tip of my finger, yet it can, if you throw 5 stones up in one mealworm, it can pick out the mealworm and bam, hit on it right away. So you can see there are armies of people, literally armies, right? Of people interested in this bat's ability to impressively navigate and track targets in space. And what he discovered is that if you use one's models that just tracked the moth, so the moth is the T that's tracking off like this, taking evasive maneuvers, that basically only use sensory information, it went off the course and never can intercept the target. It had to use predictive modeling, right, to intercept, that's these lines here, the target. That means the bat, if you want to say the bat knows things, knows where the moth is likely to go. It has a representation, a model, a simulation of the world in its head that allows it to navigate in its world. Now, when I was talking to Harry about this, and we were talking to some other people, they're like, I don't know, do bats know things, You know, how does this really work? And he said, the story I have for this is I was hanging out with all these other bat researchers, and they used to keep the bat in this bat cage, right? And bats sleep upside down, of course. So the bat would swoop down in where the door opened, right? Do a somersault and hook up with its feet on top of the perch, right? And it'd be hanging there like bats do. And they said, let's see if the bat really uses sensory information, right? Turn the cage. I don't think they went through any kind of animal ethics review for this. I'm not endorsing this, right? But what he said is, okay, let's rotate the cage, and what happens? So the bat flies up, does its somersault, smack, right into the back of the cage wall where the door is supposed to be, and flops to the ground, right? Didn't die. But the point being is that the bat was just relying on knowing where the door normally is, not actually sensing where it is. Because actually, most bats fly around most of the time by memory in some sense, or a model of the world, because if they use their echolocation too much, they actually give away their position to the things they're trying to attack, right? Not to mention the fact that it is, for them, very metabolically demanding, processing demanding, to process all that information. Does that make sense? Okay. So we're the same way. It's the same story, like when you go to the bathroom at night, and if someone moves things around, that's bad. If your kitchen gets moved around, it gets bad. So imagine what happens when you have a huge earthquake that changes entirely your environment. So normally, I get in my car, right, and I'll drive home, and mindlessly I'll just pull off where I know I need to get groceries or whether because the grocery store is there. If the grocery store is no longer there, I've got to totally spend a lot of time trying to figure out where things are again in my environment. It'd be like if you go home tonight and you're going to cook yourself dinner, tea, right, tea, and someone in your kitchen decides to move everything in your kitchen around. How long is it going to take you to make tea versus when you normally have things where you know where they are? The pepper's here, the salt's there, this is there, this is there. All of a sudden, it's everywhere. It's hard, right? Does this make sense? So all that time I'm going to do processing that other stuff is going to cause cognitive disruptions. Now, psychologists use a kind of fancy term for this, and if it gets really bad, you have to go talk to the clinician, right? They talk about clinical dissociation or extreme dissociation or whatever. But in a normal context, disruptions of your cognitive activity, they just label it as dissociation. It means disrupting your normal processing. When they've looked at this, they mostly use So far, they've at least mostly used questionnaires and asked people how they thought about thinking about things. So after I know that sounded strange, but after the San Francisco earthquake in 1989, which caused some change in their environment, they did do studies where they asked people to report their feelings of these alterations in cognition. So this is 1 week after the earthquake, and this is 4 months, and they were looking at changes. And what they're really interested in is what happened immediately after, how peaked up they were. And you see that the scores, now you might not know exactly what these mean, to be honest with you, I'm not sure I exactly know what these mean, but what it means is it was really high right after the earthquake event, and then it kind of died down. Most of the things that we might call clinical dissociation for most folks, things like extreme dissociation, hallucinations, the stuff you see in movies with people with multiple personalities, that kind of stuff, alternation, pain perception, those were very low anyways. But normal people had what we might call more normal changes in cognition or dissociation. Alterations in cognition, alterations in how memory operated, alternations in time perception. Did time take longer or shorter than it normally does from my point of view? Alternations in senses of self, which is this depersonalization. It doesn't have to be extreme, like you don't really think you're yourself anymore. It's just that, I got this feeling that I wasn't really there. Somatic anxiety, derealization, same kind of thing. When you're zoned out, you're just like, and someone says, snap out of it, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm in the world. Okay, so that's that earthquake brain thing that most people have been talking about, right? Where you're just having these zone out episodes. Now, presumably, you're having those zone-out episodes because you're trying to reconfigure your world, and it will die down as the world becomes more stable, right? Once you get your map reformed or your simulation of the world, you should be doing less of that zoning out. That's a good story, right? Should be going down a bit. The other bit of that model, though, where we were talking about assessing the environmental demands and threats, is that if people make the assessment, not everybody necessarily will make the same kind of assessment, right? That the environment is threatening, meaning these earthquakes are not stopping, and I think this is threatening me, right? Or whatever. That people will have these two kind of global responses, behavioral responses to this kind of stress. What we call anxiety or depression. Again, these are commonly used clinical terms, but they're quite normal to happen because it's based on biological reality. Most of the things, considering we're an animal, that we would be afraid of in our historical past would be what? Yeah, things that eat you. Right? We have a deathly fear of things that can eat us. And most of the times when we have threats that we deal with, we usually associate agency with them. What we mean by agency is we give them a mind. We give them something that's planning to get us, right? So if you ever watch science fiction films like The Terminator or whatever, it isn't that the robots they don't really need us anymore and they just happen to crush us because they're trying to do something else. No, they're out to get us. This is the same thing with natural disasters, even to some extent, that we sometimes apply a kind of agency to it, that it's out to get us. In the old days, they would say, Neptune doesn't like us anymore, so he sent the wave to get us. It's that idea that there's something out there to get us, because biologically, the most common threat we would have is an agent, meaning the lion does intend to eat you. I don't know how conscious lions are or not, but the lion really does want to come get you and eat you. Okay, so given that, our responses to threats are mostly based on that biological past, which is how to deal with predators. So anxiety is a quite common, what they commonly call flight or fight, right? I want to get out of here, or I'm going to prepare for battle with whatever's coming in. With an earthquake, there isn't much opportunity for fight. So it's mostly going to be flight. So anxiety here would be, you have a little shake and go, I wonder how cheap tickets are to Australia. Right? Does anybody need a psychologist over in Australia? Right? Okay, so that's that kind of immediate response. It makes sense biologically. It's to get the heck away from the threat. The other response, though, which sometimes people think is kind of paradoxical, right, is what's called depression, right? But this makes perfect sense from a biological point of view, which is the predator is coming to get you. You get the proverbial deer in the headlights response, which is, if I don't move, it won't see me and eat me. How many of you have seen this film? It's a bit dated now, Jurassic Park, right? Jurassic Park's this movie, to summarize it real quick, right? They reinvent, so to speak, or reincarnate, whatever you want to call that. They bring back dinosaurs from the past, right? And they have this big park, and they get loose, and they start going around eating people. So in one scene in this movie, they're sitting in this car, right? And there's this Tyrannosaurus Rex, the biggest predator, land predator we know of or whatever, stalking around outside, and the guy's like, don't move, don't move. Because T-Rex is sensitive to movement, right? Most predators are. So if you start moving, any kind of camouflage you would have is given away almost immediately. We're very primed. Even we're very primed for motion, right? If people move, it's like movement attracts our attention. Same thing with predators. So if you move, you die. So a natural biological response to a threat is to be like, to A, not give away your position to the predator, and B, if the predator happened to find you or something, the release brace for impact, right? In some sense. Okay. It's what biologists call tonic immobility, meaning you become immobile because it actually is a quite effective defensive mechanism. Now, I'm not saying it would necessarily always work with earthquakes, but you could think of contexts where it even work with an earthquake. You have an aftershock and you think, oh my gosh, and you run towards the staircase, and then another one happens and it throws you down the steps, and the person who was depressed, right, sitting in their chair drinking, you know, whatever, he goes like, I don't think I want to move. That's an adaptive response in some response, right? Even in the earthquake context where it is a sense of bracing yourself for it, it can be considered sort of adaptive. I'm not saying it always is, but it is based on our biological history. It's quite normal, right, that you would have this kind of response. Okay, having said that, how do we know about these kind of things? So what psychologists do most of the time is ask people, or people that emulate psychologists, right? They'll ask you how you feel. There are downsides with this, but it is a very direct way to get at, when we're talking about that model, those conscious level states, right? Okay, so what they've come up with is questionnaires, and some of you might have even seen these questionnaires, been asked these questions, so on and so on. And one of the most common one is this thing called the DAS, and in this case I'm showing the shortened version, but it basically measures depression, anxiety, and stress. And it turns out, you'll say, well, wait a minute, you said there were 2, and why do they have 3? Because anxiety and stress are really highly similar. It's just that what they mean by anxiety are these more immediate physiological responses, and the stress is the more kind of conscious, higher level response, right? I mean, if you look at the kind of questions that it relates to, is things like overreact, do you feel touchy, are you nervous, are you relaxed, are you wind down, are you intolerant, agitated? And then if you look at the anxiety ones, breathing, dry mouth, hard action, scared, you can see that that's the more biological underneath, so to speak, to the more cognitive stress. These things are very highly related. Depression's the other bit, right? And at the conscious level, it can be things like I feel blue, but from a biological point of view, the I feel blue, I don't feel like doing anything is really keeping you safe from the predator, right? I don't feel like moving. Okay, the predator went away. Okay. So our first study was to look at differences amongst people in this self-reported depression, anxiety, stress, sleep disruptions, and cognitive intrusions after the September 4th earthquake. So September 4th earthquake, waited a bit, asked people. The way we did this is we went out to people, 299 people. Now this wasn't the best way of doing a sample because we actually used a technique called snowball sampling, where you get people and then you get them to get people for you. This was useful though after the earthquake because we didn't know exactly where people would be, and kind of a lot of people, even after September 4th, one might have left and so on. So we used this technique. And then we also got people from, 240 of these people were in Christchurch on September 4th, and then we also got 59 people, what we call the control group, right, who were outside of the zone of earthquake effect, just to compare. Okay, so if you do that, and you look at the earthquake sample versus another New Zealand sample who weren't in Christchurch, you'll see that there is differences in what we call statistically significant differences, which means they pique our interest as scientists. I'm not saying that necessarily piques anybody else's interest, but it does pique our interest because it means there might be something really going on there. There might be a real difference. So what do we see that's different? Sleep disruption. People in the earthquake sample said they felt more, like their sleep was more disrupted. They also had more positive experiences related to dealing with earthquakes, like sense of community, involvement, so on. That makes sense because the other people weren't around. I mean, why would they feel anything? Average stress was much higher than in the non-Christchurch sample. Cognitive disruption was higher. Average hours of sleep was much lower. Average depression was higher, and average anxiety was higher. And this was about a month, a couple weeks, a month later. We also then looked at, within the sample that was in Christchurch, we looked at differences perhaps between males and females, which that's the largest separation in the human species, right? And we see that indeed, women report much more stress than men do, but I'll get to a minute whether or not that really means they really are more stressed. Because what people say and what they are might be something different. They say they're much more cognitively disrupted. They say their sleep disruption is higher. Their average anxiety is higher. Their average depression is higher. Their average hours of sleep a night, reported, we didn't actually measure it, was lower. And positive experiences also was higher, though. So that's the net benefit. And what I was saying is hesitant about the questionnaire stuff. I'll get into that a bit about whether or not, how much we should rely on that. Because there would be reasons to suspect there could be gender differences other than just a reality of what they feel, right? There are differences, presumably, in social acceptability of people responding in certain ways. If you think about New Zealand culture, I think they did a study of gender roles where kids, they'd ask little kids, what's a female task, what's a male task? And this was a way of trying to get at how do kids conceptualize male and female roles in their societies. And other countries, and I'm not saying all the countries that was fully representative of the countries around the world, but other countries they measured, New Zealand was second behind Pakistan in having very clear gender roles. And if you think about, I'm not saying this in a negative way, but I'm saying if you think about the cultural persona of some of the roles in New Zealand, not that, this in no way saying anything negative connotation or that New Zealand's not egalitarian, so on. I'm not saying that, but if you think about the image it projects, is the Kiwi bloke, right, the person who goes and does a accident, right, and locks off their arm and then super glues it back on and says, no worries, mate, and goes to play rugby or something like that, that projection, it probably is a bit different, right, between the two. Okay, anyways, now to get to what we call the objective level of events, right, there is a difference between, of the sample that was in Christchurch, right, between those who reported having damage to their house and people who didn't, meaning it does reflect some of the objective reality of how much environmental stress, let's say, threat they've confronted, right? So it is somewhat reflective of that reality, right? So there is higher cognitive disruption in people that have reported damage. There's higher positive experience as well. Presumably that's because the neighbor is helping them. Average stress is higher, average depression is higher, and average anxiety is higher significantly. The sleep disruption is slightly higher, but it doesn't turn out to be statistically significant, and the average hours of sleep at night actually slightly higher for damage, but again, that's statistically essentially the same, bit different. So it does reflect the real threat in some sense, like having damage. Not to say that people that haven't had damage to their house weren't the only ones affected by September 4th event, but it means that it reflects the reality for you. Okay. Now, the other bit of it where we get back to that gender differences, and then we're thinking, okay, what does this mean for objective performance differences between males and females? And so we looked at grades at the University of Canterbury. Now, the first thing you should notice is generally females do better than males regardless as students, meaning their GPAs are higher, their grade point averages. But if we looked after this is the intervention here, semester 1 and semester 2, so the earthquake event in semester 2, there's no differential effect on women versus men students, right? So that means even if women report being more stressed, it doesn't seem to impact their actual performance in this school environment at least, right? Where we have fairly good metrics and it tends to be, as much as we can, be objective, right? And things like that. I mean, it doesn't seem to reflect that. So again, it opens that question of whether or not we should only regard what people say they experience versus what they can do. Okay, so getting to that bit, what happens to the actual cognitive performance before and after an earthquake event? So one of the things that we could do, because we lucked out, we had people do these kind of, because we're in the psychology department, these kind of looked arbitrary kind of tasks before and after an earthquake. And we're interested in whether or not it can affect, from my point of view, whether it can affect normal everyday workday experience or everyday experience. And one of the places where we might really be concerned with something similar to what you call earthquake brain or these cognitive dissociations is when you're operating machinery. Because when you're operating machinery, you can be quite dangerous to other people. And one of the things they figured out pretty quickly after the 9/11 event, September 9/11, right, the big terrorist attack in New York City, is that there was an effect on driving fatalities and driving accidents after the event. The first theory that people put out there's this guy in Germany named Gerhard Gerenzer, and he said, well, it makes sort of sense, right? Airplanes are dangerous. What do people do? Get in the cars. So there are more people on the road, more likely to have accidents. That turned out to largely be what they call an ecological fallacy decision, right? It turns out that the effect was actually, it wasn't everywhere where people got information about it. It was very regionalized to the northeast part of the United States. If you look at this is 1999, 2000, 2001. If you look at fatal traffic accidents, and this is norm versus the average occurrence, post-September it spikes real high. If you look at some of the other variables that make you believe this might be sort of regional, as you look at things like the northern South Atlantic, the rest of the country, and the Northeast, it really happens in the Northeast. So it's the area around New York that gets mostly affected, not the whole country where everybody got information about, ooh, there could be terrorists on planes, maybe I shouldn't travel by plane. And also if you look at a thing that's related to this, stress effect, is that you see citations for drug and alcohol abuse spike really, really high in the Northeast, around New York City, not around other places in the United States, right? So it seems to be reflective of some of the stress. Now, this isn't particularly great data either, where they have really good data on what happens after a traumatic event, something like a terror attack or something like that, is in the country of Israel, because they have them all the time. And what they were able to do is actually look at what happens to driving fatalities after a terror attack, and then a couple days later and see what happens. Now, the intriguing thing here is that idea that people don't drive by their cars, right, is true, right, but in the reverse way. Actually, people drive less, but they have more fatalities. A lot more fatalities than normal. And they're driving, this is peak volume, right, traffic volume, much less, right? So it's even worse than we thought, meaning there are less people on the road and they're dying more in accidents. It's not because traffic is denser or anything like that. It's because something's wrong with the brain. Earthquake brain. Okay. This can make us nervous, right? Because we know from what we know about the biological system of the brain, and again, what we're talking about with this model, that you can't do everything you'd like to do at the same time. That's why they don't let you text while you're driving your car. That essentially remapping the environment after a traumatic event like this, right? Because your environment changes, can suck away resources from driving a car just like texting somebody, right? This is a potential risk. Okay, so if that's the case, right, we're saying the resources are getting funneled off this way to do this off-task processing, right, which again is saying basically this internal default mode network is suppressing the sensory processing parts of your brain. That's a problem. So we looked at this because we had them doing this task before and after the event by luck, in some sense, right? They did it on July 30th, 2010, on a Friday at 2 p.m., and then after the earthquake happened on September 24th, Friday, 2 p.m., right? We keep the day the same, so we make sure it's not just a day effect. We keep time of day the same, so we make sure that it's not just something like, oh, it's early in the morning, I feel drowsy, or it's late in the afternoon, and I got the post-lunch blue, hunger thing, I'm not there. We keep it all the same as much as we can. The big difference is that the earthquake event happened in between. The task that we make them do is actually not that fun. Basically, you look at an array of these, we call them masks. They're essentially plus signs, right? And you're looking for a particular digit that comes up behind anywhere behind these plus signs, right? And most of them you respond to. So most of the numbers you're like, and every once in a while, one of the numbers comes up that we tell you beforehand. In this case, let's say 3. You don't respond to. So you're put, oh, right? It really engages how well you're paying attention to what's coming up, and this is done very quickly. So it'd be like doom, 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 right? It'd be this continuous engagement of this stuff, and it happens very fast. So it's like, oops. Okay, so if you have this kind of task, what can we measure from it? And we actually can measure quite a bit. We can measure what we call errors of omission. This is not responding when you should have. So most of the numbers you're supposed to press a button to, right? Once in a while, you're supposed to withhold. So we can measure those withholding mistakes, what we call errors of commission. You made a mistake that you shouldn't have. You pressed the button when you shouldn't have. And we can also measure how quickly you were responding. And what we find is that after the earthquake, now the absolute measure of this isn't that much. These are errors that you make. But the difference is huge afterwards. All these metrics of performance should get better with practice. And that's what we've learned from years and years and years of doing studies. Anytime you do something more than once, you should get better at it, not worse. They get a lot worse. In errors of omission. Now you think about that. They're not, they should have been pressing and they're not. Well, if you're zoned out, oh, that would be that, right? Errors of commission don't change that much, right? You're able to withhold to the critical target stimulus fairly well. And response time doesn't really change that much either, although all these things should be getting better, which means response time should be getting much faster. What we did see, though, is if you control for your before performance, right, before the earthquake, this is complicated. I don't want to get too much detailed about all the statistical nuances and stuff. But basically, people are individually different in how they deal with this task anyways, right? There are some people that are quick to respond, and they blow through things. So if you ever seen people that are working with their text, their phone, right, and they're like me, they're impulsive or something, and they're like, I'm using it, and I'm trying to find those letters, and I can't use predictive texting. For some reason, it messes me up, and I'm sitting there going, and I always blow through it, and I'm like, boo, I blew through it again, right? The impulsive kind of person. So there are people like that anyway. So they're going to have quick reaction times, and they're going to make more errors of commission. And they're going to be people that are more like slow and kind of, they don't respond very fast, and they don't make as many errors of commission, right? Blow through targets. If we control for their performance, which means we're controlling for the fact that they're inherently different in how they respond, and then we ask them how did they feel after the earthquake, anxiety and depression, right? You get the effect you'd expect. The people who get an anxious response to the earthquake relative to how they performed before get faster, right? And they make more errors of commission. The people who have a depressive response, they go the other way, right? They get slower, right? And make less errors. Does this sort of make sense? And it makes sense with what we know about anxiety and depression. Anxiety is to get you going, right? Oh, I got to get out of here. And depression's like, I don't want to do anything. And so I'm going to be slow to respond, right? The cool thing about this is if we knew what your performance is like typically, so if let's say we made a device that could keep track of this for a while, you get on the computer and or it's on your cell phone and like and then we have an event like this and we want to know what really happened to you, we don't have to trust what you say. We can just measure what happened to your performance. The same thing's true with those zoning out episodes, and it turns out that it might be that some people, now I'm not saying everybody, but there are lots of reasons why some people wouldn't tell you exactly what's going on. So let's say, for example, you have a critical job and you got economic demands. I got to get paid or my kids don't eat. And you say, are you fit to drive the bulldozer? And I'm like, sure enough. And in reality, I'm like, and I drive right into a building or something like that. That's bad. There are cases, although lots of times in a research setting, it's fine. If it's an anonymous interview or something like that and people really believe it's anonymous, it's fine. People will tell you what they, but in a work setting, you can't always trust what people tell you, right? Especially if it means their paycheck, right? Does that make sense? We've learned that in the human factors world for a long time with dealing with people where they love their job so much they don't want to ever get, I'll be blunt, grounded is usually pilots, right? They don't want to be told they can't fly. Or in some groups like special operations groups and military units and stuff like that, they'll go into work with a broken ankle and they'll be like, I'm fine. I'm ready to roll, right? They don't want to have things. So you can't always trust what people say. So the take-home message is, from this study we did, is that on the whole, most people will experience these zoning out episodes. That seemed to be common across a group. Didn't matter about individual differences per se. There were differences in people, how much zoning out episodes they would have or not, but most people got worse. They're zoning out. They should have gotten better. That would make sense given that model. Even if you don't think it's a threatening environment, the environment changes, you got to think about the environment. It's going to suck away from doing what you're doing now. The other bit of it is, if you got an anxious response, you did become more impulsive and rash. This might be important even if this kind of leverages up to higher order decision making, right? That if someone feels anxious about the earthquake, they might make impulsive and rash decisions, not just on a computer task or whatever, but important ones like, should I buy a ticket to Australia? Should I move there? Should I, whatever. I give you an example of this. I feel really anxious about earthquakes, so I'm going to move, let's say, even though my work might be in Christchurch, all the way past Ashburton or someplace because I think it's safer. But the reality, of course, would be what? I'm more likely to die in a road accident than I am in an earthquake. So it wasn't actually, from an actuarial point of view, the best decision, right? Okay, so you get anxious responses. Depressed people who have a depressive response will become more conservative, slow, and sacrifice speed for accuracy. This also might have real-world implications. The coolest thing about this, from my point of view, is that it means I don't have to rely on what you say, per se. I can come up with cognitive tasks that make you do something and see if you're really ready to do what you're supposed to be doing, right? Because there are situations, like again, I'm not saying that we can't trust what most people say most of the time, but there are settings where I'm not going to buy it, right? I'm going to go with what you can do, not what you say you can do. Okay. So study 3, another study we looked at to kind of get more at these cognitive measures. Do they actually measure something? This is one of the ones that Neville was talking about that's actually been accepted for publication already. Is looking at cognitive disruption. So this is how much you say you thought about the earthquake. This is to tie in on that fact that these performance measures, some of them can actually pick up on what we might call the real bits of that thing where you're thinking about this event, right? So people will say, yes, I thought about the earthquake a lot. Does it relate to real performance? And we had a similar type of task that you saw before, this task where you have to pay attention and you press buttons and hope and withhold. And what we found is that the correlation between it, this is the cognitively induced disruption, right? How much do you think about earthquakes? And the actual average errors of commission on that task were really high, actually. High enough that some of the reviewers are like, that's almost too high. Because most of the time in psychology, they don't get things that look like this. It's much weaker effects. This is very strong. And this was almost immediately after the September 4 earthquake, which explains some of it. This all weans out as it goes on time because you don't have to think as much about the earthquake event once things get right. But it'll pop up again. So after February 22nd, you expect it to go back up because the environment changed again. Okay. So it's again getting at that readiness for things. The next question we're interested in, so we did another study, is when exactly would you expect this earthquake brain to happen, right? Because one of the concerns some people might raise is, would this happen when someone's under immediate threat in their environment, right? Could it be that, you have to deal with an event immediately? So I'm sitting there and I've got, some earthquake stuff, and I've got maybe some earthquake brain kind of thing going on, dissociation, whatever you want to call that, and daydreaming, thinking about how my environment's changed and da-da-da-da-da. And then we get another earthquake event and something happens and I have to mobilize and get going on that task right away. Would it be that that gets shut off that enables me to deal with the here and now right away, right? And so what we did is we did some research. We got 40 volunteers from the public, and we had them they were ranged from 18 to 50, so it was partially students, but because that's who our students know, but it was also other people from outside the university, so it's not just university students. We got 20 males and 20 females, and we brought them in. And what we did here is a little bit more sophisticated. So what this thing here is called is a functional near-infrared spectroscopy system. If you've ever gone to your physician, right, and they put this little thing on your finger, right, and it has light, and you can see it lights up your finger, it's measuring the amount of oxygen in your finger, right? Does that make sense? Oxygen is good, typically. You can't have too much oxygen sometimes, but it's good, right? So what you can do is the same technology on your head, right? And despite what you might think, your skull actually can transmit light through it, right? So you put this on their head, and as long as you don't get on their nasal cavities, which is easy to know actually because you just stick a pin light up their nose and it lights up. You can actually measure the amount of oxygen or oxygenated hemoglobin relative to deoxygenated hemoglobin. I don't want to get too much into technicalities of biology, but basically, similar to fMRI, you can see which parts of the brain are lighting up. Right? In a gross way, what you might be interested in is the right and the left. And does this relate to anything to how they say they feel about earthquakes and some of the things we're going to do to them? The other thing we did to them is we made them do this task that was almost worse than the other one I told you about, where you have to do the number thing or whatever. Right? In this one, you have to find very light gray O's versus D's and backwards D's, right? And the O's occur very rarely. In a mask like this that camouflages, and trust me, this is very, very hard to do. Meaning people do it for about 8 minutes and they're complaining like crazy. They're like, oh, this is hard. I don't want to make it sound too hard because then the ethics committee might not let me do it anymore. But right, it is difficult. What I would say is it's challenging, right? It's been used by U.S. military forces and stuff like that as a screener for all kinds of tasks where people really need to pay attention. They need to know if they can pay attention or not. It is challenging, even more challenging than it just looks here. But what we also did in this, which was novel, is during the task we actually inserted pictures, right? And so we had them do the task with what we call the arousing picture groups, right? These would be things that might be considered, again, I don't want to make it sound too bad, because this is pictures, you could see them on TV or whatever. It doesn't scare people per se, right? But things like this snarling dog, a snake, right? A gun, something like that. Versus neutral pictures. So they did the task with the arousing pictures, and they did the task with the neutral pictures, right? And they did it in a counterbalanced way, so we make sure it wasn't just order effects and all this kind of stuff. But essentially what it allowed us to do is say, if under a threat, would people still be having interference from that earthquake type stuff versus when they don't have that, right, on this challenging task. And again, looking from this model point of view, the argument we're trying to figure out is, if they had something in here that says, I got a demand really bad, right? I feel distressed, tension, whatever. Would it shut off this to this other thing out here, right? Even if that's related to thinking about the earthquake. Could you have an earthquake brain event, whatever you want to call that, dissociation, under threat, right? Or would that automatically kind of shut it off? Okay, now the way we could figure this out is we're trying to map on the different measures that we're interested in to that bigger model, right? And the bits I told you about that have the circle things, engagement, worry, distress, we can ask people how they feel. And again, in an experimental setting, there's no reason to really, like this, you don't really not trust them per se. Again, there are always qualms with trusting what people say, but so we measured this with questionnaires that measured for engagement, energetic arousal. This is how engaged you feel with the activity, how energetic you feel, not fatigued, so on. Distress, we used a measure of tense arousal, which is generally I feel tense, anxious, right? Not good. And for worry, we used measures that measure things like task-related thoughts. This is how much did I think about the task at hand, things about the task, my performance on the task, why am I in this task? And task-unrelated thoughts, this would be things about other stuff, right? What my mother did today, whatever. Okay, so we asked questionnaires. We did that before and after, so we compare what were you thinking about and how did you feel before you did the task and how you did it on both of these tasks, the ones with the negative pictures and the ones with the neutral pictures. We also compared their objective performance. So this is their ability to detect those O targets relative to the Ds and backwards D targets. And as you see, they get worse over time. That's what we psychologists call the vigilance decrement, which is a ubiquitous thing about these sustained attention tasks. People can't seem to stay focused, even if they really want to. Over time, but it's worse, overall performance is worse, of course, with the negative pictures, right? So even though they're more aroused, they still can't pay attention that well. But they are getting worse in both cases, and as you see in the last period, they're very similar. The change is mostly around in here. We also looked at that brain imaging thing, and we wanted to make sure that the task worked somehow really, right, different, right? And the way we trust really is it changed something physiologically, not just you said you felt different. Right? And it did. Meaning if I look at the actual oxygenation among the hemispheres, the negative task activated the right hemisphere more than it did the left hemisphere, and the neutral pictures go the other way around. Now this sort of makes sense because there are multiple theories of how emotions process in the brain. Most of it's only applicable to right-handers, sorry enough to say, because that's what mostly people have studied, and they have more consistent mapping between their hemispheres and their lateralization, what they use as their hand and task, right? So, but most of this research shows that emotions done in the right, or if not emotion, at least negative emotions is done in the right, and maybe perhaps positive emotions are done in the left, right? That generally that the right-left differences are quite biologically based on that reality of predators and finding things to eat. So things that relate to finding things to eat are more on the left hemisphere for most people, right-handers. And things that are about getting away from predators are mostly in the right hemisphere. So negative emotions, withdrawal emotions, detecting peripheral targets, vigilance, things like that are all done in the right. Things like close-up, talking to people, right, language, positive emotions, getting approach emotions, things like that are all done in the left. So it's not shocking that the negative pictures or threat appraisal would be activating the right hemisphere relative to the left. If we ask people how they felt, this is based on change scores. So this is the difference before they went in for the person and how they felt after these two tasks. Generally, their energetic arousal didn't change too much, and the negative arousal was a bit higher for energetic arousal than for the neutral condition, which makes sense, right? It's threatening, it's energizing. And their tension's higher. They thought more about the task when it had negative pictures. Well, that makes sense because the pictures were probably in the task, and that's presumably why it made them do actually worse, is because they were thinking about those pictures. And the task-unrelated thoughts weren't that much different. The interesting thing is that we also asked them that stress, anxiety, depression questionnaire linked back to the earthquake event and said, so how did that relate to these behavioral measures? The really intriguing bit is that, get back at that question, would the negative picture somehow shut off impacts from the earthquake on performance, is you only saw significant correlations, what are interesting to us scientists, right? Which means they're not just chance or flukes, right? They might be real, between these measures and the performance measures and the brain measures and the self-report measures from the task during the neutral picture condition. In the threatening negative picture condition, those correlations weren't significant, right? Which means it could be just fluke, chance, whatever. Okay, the interesting bit here is if you felt more stress, your change in performance over time, that drop in performance, right? So if I go back real quick, here, this drop for you individually was worse if you felt stress from the earthquake. So it did affect your neutral picture performance in a negative way. I mean, if you felt stress from the earthquake, it leaked into the task that you were doing, where you had to pay attention in the neutral condition. The anxiety measure linked up to the arousal measures. The stress measure also made you think more about the task, but only in the neutral condition significantly. The really interesting bit is that depression actually seemed to be linked to your oxygen response in your brain in the way you kind of expect it would, which is that it suppressed activation, right? Which again, you think about what is depression from a biological point of view, is you become very conservative. You're like, I'm not going to move. And what actually happens to your blood supply to your brain in some sense is it also goes down. So it's not just talk. I mean, there is a link between what people say they experience and this. Now, again, this isn't cause and effect per se. It could be that the kind of people that would be like that would have different responses to task and how their brain operates anyways, but it is interesting. Okay. The next study that I wanted to bring out is, okay, so now we got this model of how the brain works. We know people are different though. How do individual differences fit in with this thing. So for example, you might say, hey, I know some guy or some gal who seems daydreamy anyways. So you're saying they're going to be more likely than to be negatively affected by an earthquake because they have even more chance to have earthquake brain because they seem to have earthquake brain when there are no earthquakes. Or not, right? This is intriguing. And the way we do this is, if we look at this model, these bits where I didn't talk about at the initial part of the talk, these parts where there are expansions in the lines or in the box itself, these are what we might call the individual differences, the fact that not everybody's the same. There might be people that have more resources available to them. There might be people with less resources available to them. There also are individual differences in how people process tasks. There are people that spend more time kind of off the ferries, right? They have a bigger line going this way, so it's easier to pump it that way, if you want, metaphor again, right? And there are people that you might know that are very, very task-focused, and they're in the here and the now, and they never seem to go backwards and forwards in time. I'm not saying anybody ever actually never does that, but they seem like they're really in the moment. They're in the now, right? They spend all their time Zen meditating, and they're really good at being here, now, in the present, not thinking about other stuff other times, right? Okay, now, again, psychologists call this cognitive interruption stuff, right, that seems to be different than normal cognition, right, dissociations. So they've actually come up with questionnaires where they can ask people about their, what they call the trait level of their dissociation experiences, right? It's called a dissociative experiences scale, right? And it measures how you typically are, not because of the earthquake, not whatever. Do you spend a lot of time having these dissociative episodes, right, where you're like, wait a minute, where am I? Oh, yeah. Zoned out episodes. You're driving down in the car and you realize, oh, I should have turned there and I didn't. Why did I do that? Are you living a lot in that mental time travel plane, right? Or are you here in the now? I might not explain that well, and some of my clinician friends might go like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Okay, but anyways, we had them do another one of these tasks. It's similar to that other one with the O's and D's. This time we made it more complicated because we had them looking for words, text-speak words and real words. This had other interests we were interested in. But the point was it was the same kind of task where you have to really focus on what you're doing and what happens when you're doing it. Did you make mistakes? Did you press buttons to things you shouldn't have, and so on. And what we found is this, which is really intriguing. So we asked people to fill out this questionnaire where they talk about not related to the earthquake per se, and there's no way to make sure that that didn't contaminate it. I don't know for sure. But how do you generally think about how you think, right? Dissociation episodes. Are you a daydreaming person? Are you kind of out at the lunch most of the time? Or are you living in the here and the now, very present, right? And we also asked them, tied back to, this was after the February 22nd earthquake, did you spend a lot of time, or do you feel that you spend a lot of time thinking about the earthquake? So that's this bit at the bottom. So we broke them into, to simplify it for this presentation, right? Broke it into the people that had less of these earthquake thoughts, and people that had more earthquake thoughts, self-reported, and people that were reported to be high in this trait level dissociation, low, sorry, and high in it, right? So these are the high people, and these are the low people. And this is the actual objective measure of that performance on that task. Did you make a lot of errors? The intriguing bit of this is that the people who have low dissociation, they tend to be the people that live in the moment now. They seem to be really affected when they have to think about something else, like earthquakes. Now, the argument I would make for this is if we go back to that model, although a lot of times we tend to have negative connotations with these terms like dissociation, anxiety, depression, whatever, emotional processing, people that are emotion copers, not problem-focused copers, a lot of that's because of the people like me who are interested in this bit of the box here, right? Meaning a lot of the psychologists who've collected data on people throughout time or whatever have been working for somebody, and those somebody want to know how people behave for the thing they're interested in, right? So if I go to work for the US military, what they're interested in is I don't want a pilot to crash a plane. I'm interested in the bit of the box down here, right? Does that make sense? That isn't always what's necessarily adaptive for the person, right? So for example, if I got hired, let's say by a disaster relief agency, or let's say a fire department or something like that, the bit they can be concerned about is how does a firefighter deal with fighting fires, right? Which is being in the now. So the things that are about dealing with the now tend to have a positive connotation because those are the things we want in firefighters. I don't want the firefighter to look at a fire and go like, and I'm not saying me personally because I'm a humanitarian, I'm not saying this kind of thing, but I'm saying if I were working for a firefighting agency, right? I don't want the firefighter to look at the fire and go like, this looks really threatening. I don't think I really need to go in that fire, and I don't think I really need to be here fighting the fire, right? I don't want that to happen, but that might be a perfectly adaptive response for that person, right? That might be the person who chooses not to be a firefighter, which might be good for them, right? The point being, though, is that although we tend to have this negative connotation of these things, there might be quite adaptive benefits to have variation in our community, right? That there are some people who are going to be focused towards the here and the now and be like very present and on it, and some people that are kind of like, maybe this isn't the best thing to be doing with our time, or maybe we should be doing something else, and they're all thinking about other stuff, right? Those are typically some of the people that think around problems, right? They don't, I mean, if you get confronted with a problem in the world, a brick wall, there are times when it is, maybe you'd say the right way to do it is just go at the brick wall and try to smash your head into it till you break through. And there are other times when it'd be like, maybe I should think around the problem, right? And it might be good for our community to have a bit of variation in this. So it's not always a bad thing to be, for example, someone who's a dissociator, because it might be that although this is looked at as like, well, maybe that's problematic from this bit here. So for example, if I was talking about fighter pilots, it wouldn't necessarily be a good thing there, right? Or firefighters. But for typical people, it might be perfectly okay for sometimes to be thinking about this thing because it has benefits, right? And that there might be individual differences. You might even think of them not even as genetically pre-programmed dispositions, but even just skill sets that enable people to process more at this side here, right? That might be one way to deal with your environment, or a specialization, if you want to call it that, of being able to deal with these other kind of thought patterns, right? You're a good time traveler. You can go backwards in time and forward in time, and you're good at doing it. And because of reality, you have to do that sometimes while you're doing a task. So you've gotten really good at doing that while you're doing other tasks, dissociating, right? Whereas other people aren't so good at that necessarily. And so when you get confronted with things where you have to think about your environment because it changed so radically, they're not as good at it, maybe, as you are. So the people that have the disposition to think about stuff and do tasks, right, they've gotten used to dissociating, so to speak, they don't seem to be impacted as much on thinking about the earthquake. The weirdest thing is that, again, I'm not making much of this because these differences probably aren't very significant, right, is they seem to do slightly better even than the ones going this way. The biggest difference is this. The people who are low on trait dissociation, they tend to not do well when they're forced to think about it. And if you thought about it as a skill, well, then it makes sense that they're not good at it, right? They're used to being here, but now they're being forced to do this, and they're not as good at shuttling these. So that's intriguing. Okay, the other thing I wanted to bring up, I think I'm running out of time, is that there is a lot of other research. I'm only one person, and I work with a team of other people, like Neville, but there are a lot of other people in our department doing all kinds of very interesting research related to how the earthquake affects people. One of the examples here of another study that was not done by me at all, that was published coming out of our department recently, was looking at micronutrients and how that might reduce and buffer people from stress. And there is interest in people in how the earthquake event changes diet. And there are a lot of reasons to think things like diet, nutrition, and so on would have real effects because, again, if we go back to that model, right, if good nutrition, because we are a biological critter, were to up these resource capacities, right, it would enable us to do more of this stuff that we're going to have to do anyways because the earthquake changed our environment better than if we didn't have it. So you can think about it that way, right? The fuel for the system is good, then it's probably going to do better than if you don't have the fuel for the system. It's appropriate, right? Because we are a real biological processor and we need real nutrients and inputs to do what we need to do. So that's part of that. The next thing I wanted to talk about is some of the research we can be doing now soon in the future. So one of the things as a scientist that is intriguing about disasters is they're really impactful on people. They're real, meaning you can go back into an experiment and try to simulate threat like this. That's a picture. Come on, you see that on TV all the freaking time. I mean, the shows that I see in New Zealand TV actually sometimes almost scare me because I'm like, I can't believe that was on TV at 8 o'clock at night. You know, where someone has something sliced through their head or whatever. The point being is that we're pretty used to these kind of low simulated threats. Earthquake, like the whole ground rocking and stuff, that's a real intimidating threat, right? That's like impactful. That's why when I talk to some of my colleagues and they ask me about the data we get, where we get things like this, these really high correlations, they're almost like, I don't believe that. But that's because they talked about threat like, well, I show you this picture. Are you scared? It's not a real dog. It's not going to really bite you, right? We've had an event, right, that does massive damage to a city. I mean, wide-scale damage. I mean, even if we were living in some place like a war zone where there might be someone who detonates themselves in a city, that's scary because there's that agent that out to get you kind of thing. But the relative impact in that environment is pretty small compared to an event that can crumble a whole city, right? I mean, that's impressive level of event. That means it's interesting from a research point of view if you can tap into that a bit with ethical regard for the person doing the thing. Now, the way you can do this to some extent is you simulate the earthquake event. Now, this might have some serious, it's not just that we're like, we want to do the research, it's cool kind of thing. This might have a lot of beneficial effects for people in themselves. One of the things they figured out with things like trauma experiences is that one of the ways to help people process this, especially if they're outside my realm, right, and they start talking about a more clinical or extreme reaction to these events, is to help them do it by slowly exposing them to that same traumatic event over and over again. In some ways, it habituates them to that event. This can have massive impacts on all kinds of physiological things. So one of the friends I had in the States was working on a thing, actually the same lab that we have here, the HIT lab, Human Interface with Technology lab. The first one was in University of Washington, and then they built another version of it here in New Zealand. Some people say actually the New Zealand one's better now. But what they discovered with this virtual reality stuff is that if you had people like burn patients even, and you put them in a virtual reality situation where you simulated the place where I used to live, Upper Michigan, where it was like snow world, right? It was this endless snow. If you're a Star Wars fan, Planet Hoth from the Empire Strikes Back, right? A world with snow. It actually reduced people's pain, feelings of pain in this kind of environment, right? They put on the goggles. You didn't actually have to do anything to them, but they felt like, oh, no, I feel better, burn victims. The other thing they realized is people that had phobias, right? If you were, for example, spider phobic, right, arachnophobic, if you had a virtual spider and you made it get closer and closer, you could decondition them to that. So you could do the same thing with an earthquake, meaning if you have some people you might know that had really bad kind of traumatic response from the earthquake, one way to get them through it is to slowly expose them to earthquakes again, and some says dehabituate them to that traumatic response. But my guess is if you put people in a room like this and you made it sway, right, they would get re-experience, so to speak, an aftershock event, right? It would sound, and you could probably enhance it with some sound and things like that. Now, you'd say, why would you want to do that to people? I mean, that sounds cruel. Again, it could be because of the therapeutic part of it. For people who do not have traumatic experiences to aftershocks, it might be useful if we wanted to further test, right, those cognitive deployment measures, right, to assess whether or not people are ready for work, because we can now elicit them to think about earthquakes by giving them the environment that simulates the earthquake, right? We'd have to do it, of course, with all kinds of safeguards to make sure we weren't, I don't want to have someone crumple to the floor and go, ah! I don't think that would happen. But, because we experience aftershocks all the time. We had 2 today, right, that were reasonable size. Most people don't crumple to the floor. Okay, so that's where we could move forward with this stuff. Now, again, I don't want a negative message coming out of this where it sounds like, oh my gosh, this is all bad. It's earthquake brain, anxiety, depression, da-da-da-da-da. A lot of this, though, can be very useful now when we go in to deal with the future. So, for example, with the case where I talked about readiness measures, where we don't have to necessarily rely on people's self-reported response, that measure, these things that were coming out of from the experience here at the University of Canterbury, in Christchurch, in Canterbury, right, can now be potentially used for other cases. So, for example, there are disasters all over the world, right? If you were thinking, oh my gosh, earthquakes are so bad, I'll move to a place where they don't have earthquakes, Virginia. I have an earthquake, right? There are disasters everywhere, right? We're totally confronted with disasters every place. There probably is no place safe on planet Earth, right, that would be totally immune to disasters. So disasters are common everywhere. So one of the things that are positive that comes out of our experience here is we could deploy some of the things we know here to other places so that they could be prepared, right? If they don't know that they're going to have a disaster yet, they could be doing things like, let's say, for example, you're working at a truck company somewhere in South Dakota, right, or in Ukraine. And you think, oh, it's pretty safe here, da-da-da-da-da, right? But if you had these readiness measures and you've been tracking with a cell phone or iPad or whatever now, these people's cognitive performance, and then they have an event, let's say a flooding event in South Dakota or something like that, and then you afterwards and you say, are you truck drivers really ready to get back on the road, or are they going to be at risk of someone else? Let's ask them. I don't want to get paid. No, I don't want to drive a truck. I'm not capable. I don't want to get paid? No, I want to get paid. No, I'm ready to get on a truck. This would mean we could deploy these technologies where we could actually assess them in the readiness for performance without having to ask them how they feel. Because again, although you might say most of the time, no, I would be honest with someone if they asked me how I feel, there are cases where you might not be, where it's like you're going to work or not, right? And so we might get that technology. Now you might say, well, isn't that not so nice because the truck driver won't get paid necessarily? But again, do you want to be on the road with a truck driver who has an earthquake brain episode and smashes into the back of your car? There are public safety concerns, right? So some of this technology that we're developing here now can actually be a benefit to society that we can deploy other places. Now the other place where you might see this readiness measure be employed and I'm not pitching it too strongly, but I'm just pointing out that it could be a benefit, is things, for example, fatigue and driving. Meaning, one of the things that we know is that fatigue kills people, right, when they're driving. So does drunk driving. But with drunk driving, we have an objective way of measuring whether or not you're incapacitated, right? The police officer goes, woo, 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 and you pull over and they go, breathe, right? They know you're drunk, or they know that your blood alcohol level is high enough that you should be drunk. If you're not, then you've probably been too much. Okay, but the point is that we don't have anything even remotely close to that with fatigue, right? Pull over. Are you ready? Are you fit to drive? No, so all these measures we're developing from the earthquake might be useful in that context as well. And that has probably broader implications for you. Again, the example I gave of someone who goes like, earthquakes are horrible. I'm going to move way far out and then drive every day, long, long distances. Actuarially speaking, they're probably actually putting themselves at greater risk. I mean, we don't usually like thinking that way, but that very well might be the case, right? Road fatalities are huge. It could definitely be the case that after a major disaster that doesn't particularly necessarily kill lots of people, it totally rearranges the environment and triggers everybody. Like, think about Irene in the United States, 6 million people without power, right? Not downplaying our event, but the relative amount of people that die might not be that high, but the fatalities afterwards from accidents might be much greater than actually the event itself, right? So anything we can develop from that would help. The other nice story from this is that what we generally know is that unless you have an extreme clinical level response, all these things like normal, like anxiety and depression, the cognitive intrusions and so on, those are all quite normal, right? So, and they get better with time, especially as our world becomes more orderly and normal again. I mean, the best thing from a personal point of view with something like earthquake brain or whatever it is that our world get back to a way where it's steady. Now, I'm not saying you can guarantee that, right? But if we can get our environment sort of where we know what's open, where's what, and we get reorganized at that, these issues will fade away for most of us, majority of us.